Welcome to another episode of the Providence Friarcast, presented by PCBB1917.com, your home for Providence College basketball news, notes, and opinions. Now here's the founder of PCBB1917.com and your host, Mike Hopkins.
It was a special game for the Friars, who were surprised by the return of Emmitt Holt in the locker room prior to the start of the game.
I appreciate him a lot because the biggest thing for him is that he's that constant for our team, I think, the biggest constant where every day he's going to challenge you, like Kyron said, and every day he's going to support you. So that's something that we always missed. And just seeing him and being in the hallways and always jumping around and being the hype guy that he's always is, I think that's the thing we missed the most.
Having him in that locker room was a dream of all of our players. He uplifted us, you want to talk about the right timing, right place, right school, right fit. It's really touching to see that young man in our locker room.
Thanks for joining us here on episode 9 of the Providence Friarcast. Chris, Brendan, and I back together this week after my dad filled in last week. But we're back to action here with the regular group. After the break, you're going to hear us talk Providence versus DePaul. Thoughts on the mic'd up broadcast that Fox Sports 1 put on for that game. Providence's win over Butler, and we're also going to preview Creighton, and some commentary on Rodney Bullock comparing his performances in November and December to how he's been so far in the last couple games with Big East play here. And I want to give a special shout-out to some of my patrons. That's JLD, John Lee Dumas, Mike Evans, Michael and Kathy Hopkins, also known as my parents, Adam Nagel, Bob Allison, Ron Torbick, Brendan Ryan, Dan Marcus, Joe DeAngelis, Dennis Corbett, Mike Sayburn, Ray Penza, Dennis Burns, Alex Simeone, Chris Thurlow, G, Terry Meyer, and Alan Russ. Special shout out to those guys there, really helpful. With the Patreon page, patreon.com/PCBB1917. For as little as $3 a month, you can get access to our Slack community. $5 a month gets you access to the special recruiting Slack channel. $10, you get a shout-out on the podcast and a few other things. So head over to patreon.com/PCBB1917, and let's go. All right, we're back for another episode of the Providence Friarcast. Chris, Brendan, and I here together after my dad admirably filled in last week, helping me out. Providence off a 2-0 week since we last spoke with the win Friday night at DePaul, 71-64, and a come-from-behind win a little bit on Saturday at home against Butler, 70-60. So, Chris, let's start with you. Give me your thoughts on the DePaul game, the Friday night. We'll talk about the mic'd up aspect, but let's go through the game quick. Obviously, a 22-0 run, a little bit, probably the largest aspect of the story. Providence kind of just all of a sudden went nuts. So just give me your thoughts from Friday night.
Yeah, I mean, the second half was huge. They managed to heat up, which they needed to. I think they were down 1 at halftime, I believe, and then they outscored DePaul 37-29 in the second half. So obviously they needed a big half from guys like Alpha. Jalen finished with 18, he 4 for 8 or something like that from 3, and Alpha had 14 of his 16 in the second half. So obviously a 22-0 run is huge, and that was near the midway point in the second half, and that's really the half that they needed. They needed guys like Alpha to step up, and it's so nice to have them healthy and have, a for the most part, healthy team besides Malik, obviously, and it's starting to show a little bit, but again, I was really impressed with Alpha in that second half. He was great, and Joan was great. Rodney played pretty well. He was a little stagnant at times, but again, they're learning to kind of cope with some of his inconsistencies. Even though he's been great, he had 8 rebounds, and he was good enough, and they could run small for a lot of the time and have him at the 5. But Alpha and Jalen were great in that second half, and Isaiah, who we've talked about numerous times, he played 27 minutes, and I think he was 4 for 8 from the field. I know he had 2 threes. Down the stretch there, he had 15 points, and he's such a difference maker for this team, and he's really proven to be a difference maker, and kind of similar to Kyron, as he goes, the team goes. And when Isaiah plays well and gives him quality minutes, it really seems to show in the results of this team. So again, that kind of showed on Friday in Chicago, and Isaiah gave in a really quality 27 minutes. So that was a real bright spot.
Yeah, to that point, I was looking at the stats earlier, and it really stuck out to me that he was obviously pretty efficient, like you said, 27 minutes, 15 points, 4 rebounds. I think he was also 5 of 6 at the line, which is always good in a close game on the road. But the thing that really hit me over the head when I was looking at the stats is he was the only player on Providence in double figures and plus minus. I don't always love plus minus, but in this case, it was just so ridiculous. The closest guy, I think, was 9, plus 9. He was plus 20.
Right, and plus 20 in 27 minutes is pretty good. And I'm with you. I'm not always crazy about plus minus. It can be a little deceptive at times, but yeah, I mean, I'm really. He was great against Xavier too. He had 18 points in I think like 25 minutes, 26 minutes, and again, very efficient. He was 4 for 6 from the field in that game, and 8 for 8. He was perfect. I don't know what it was, but he was perfect from the line against Xavier too. So he's been really great down the stretch over the last since really the Marquette game or something like that. I think it was because he didn't really do much against Creighton. So I really love the way he's been playing. I'm sure Cooley loves having him as a viable option coming off the bench.
The other aspect, too, that was interesting, Cooley, I think, obviously must have made this one of the big parts of the game plan, but they really contained Max Strus, who was their leading scorer. He went 3 of 13, 2 of 8 from 3, and he played all 40 minutes. So to keep him in single digits, which hasn't really happened a lot this year, and really something that I found interesting that they did sort of against Xavier is they were really trying to limit Blewett a lot, which they did, and they sort of allowed Cantor to kind of get some easy baskets inside, trading that as long as they had good offense. And that kind of happened again against DePaul, where they were letting Marich kind of score some points here and there, but they were really containing Strus, who's their most explosive scorer. So interesting to see going forward. I know they did the same thing against Butler. We'll talk about that. Keelan Martin really quiet after a career game in the game before against Marquette. But containing Strus was a huge part of it. One other thing to mention, Nate Watson dealing with the flu a little bit. Also didn't play much against Butler. He didn't start, actually. And I think he only played because Cooley got pissed at Young for a minute. But he's clearly still dealing with a little bit of the flu, though hopefully you'd have him back after a week in between games for Creighton. But just to close out on DePaul, we'll talk a little bit here about the mic'd up. It was a pretty interesting broadcast. I know Chris and I were talking a little bit that night, and also subsequently about some of the pregame commentary that, if you were listening to the Ed Cooley channel, you were treated to, which thankfully did not make air because he might have been arrested. But really a cool, overall, a very cool broadcast. I asked people on Twitter for some thoughts, and I'll read some of those tweets in a little bit, but really interesting broadcast. I did find myself being very distracted for the first 5 or so minutes of the game. I remember looking up and being like, oh man, there's already been 18 points scored. I didn't even really notice, because you found yourself kind of staring at the coach's box a little bit, or trying to really listen to what the coaches are saying. I didn't really buy into the fact that the coaches were too loud. I did think the coaches' boxes are a little too big if they would decide to do this in the future. But overall, I thought it was very cool, and you got a lot of insight into what coaches are saying in the huddle every single time, hearing how they're encouraging players. Cooley obviously listens to his players, which you saw at halftime too, talking about whether they prefer man or zone. So let me get your thoughts, Chris. I just thought it was cool overall, maybe a little more of a novelty.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, obviously, like you said, it was a little distracting. I wasn't totally paying attention to the game. I was more focusing on Cooley, talking about vampires and stuff like that, which was cool. It was just something different. I do agree with you in saying that maybe if we're going to critique it a little bit, the box of the actual game itself was a little bit small. I actually was doing some other coverage that night for the Washington Wizards, so I had it on my laptop, and I had the game feed on, but just with Cooley's mic in the background. So I was only listening to Cooley. I didn't listen to any of the DePaul side, but I thought it was great. And, obviously they knew what they were doing when they picked Cooley. He's one of the more eccentric coaches in the entire country, let alone the Big East. So he was pretty entertaining, and especially before the game when you could listen to him in the locker room during warm-ups, it was pretty funny. He's probably happy it wasn't broadcasted on FS1. But it was a lot of fun. It was a nice little change and gave an interesting perspective on the game, and I'm sure people enjoyed that.
About the mic'd up game, I had an opportunity to watch it. I didn't watch it live that night because I was out covering a high school game. But in the beginning, you were kind of like confused and wondering if the announcers, to me, Joe Davis and Len Elmore, they were almost like there but not there. You didn't even know it because they were almost like wondering, okay, we don't want to step on Dave Lato's toes or Ed Cooley's toes, but to be fair, I think the Big East knew what they were getting into when they asked Ed Cooley to do this. He was very, he delivered on that front. He was very interesting, almost entertaining, if that's the way he typically behaves during a game. I thought the Dracula vampire reference when there was blood on the court, that was the jersey. I believe it was Alpha Diallo, and I thought that was very entertaining. And overall, I thought it was an intriguing product. Sometimes some people I've talked to, they would complain. They thought, do we really have to know this? It was kind of distracting a little bit. And I said, yeah, you can see it that way. But also, maybe once a year, you kind of take a step back and get into the inner circle of what the nuts and bolts are of a team. And, Fox Sports 1, to their credit, and the Big East, they were able to take us behind the curtain, so to speak, and show us what goes into a Big East basketball game.
Yeah, just to give some readers their opinions to get on here. So I put up a poll the next day. Did you enjoy the mic'd up game Friday night? I guess it's maybe a few days later. 330 people voted. 89% said yes. Some of the comments, kind of a mixed bag, but kind of some similar threads going through. Pat O'Brien, I did enjoy it and would like to see more during the season. Ed mic'd up has got to be a great recruiting tool. Only downsides, I imagine, it's fairly distracting for the coach. I often found myself following Ed more than the game. So that's interesting. I thought I sort of share a lot of that. Chuck, one of my buddies, yes, but one time per year for any given team is probably enough. Distracting and just loud, but interesting as well for sure. It was definitely distracting at first, but I got used to it, says Tommy Larson. Meg O'Keefe, shout out to Meg. Love to hear the emotion in their voices. Plus, they said some funny shit. Interesting, I agree. Certainly, the vampire stuff, as you mentioned, was picked up a little bit by some of the national media. Paul Mondor provided great insight into how many moving parts a college coach has to manage. Also put Ed Cooley's great sense of humor on display. Now, that's interesting because I feel like sometimes I think that maybe aside from the potential for recruiting, you getting to see Cooley really with his players in that environment. I think the other really interesting aspect for people who don't get to sit behind the bench or next to the bench like some people do at the dunk or elsewhere is that I think people really get to see there is a lot of X's and O's that go into a game like that and how technical Cooley is in the huddle with the players and how especially Cartwright has such an understanding. It's clear he's directing people. He's in the huddle. He's saying, well, we haven't run this yet. Let's run that. And for Cooley to respect his senior's opinion like that, I think that's really cool to see. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that one, Chris.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was gave some pretty cool insight on how he lets his team kind of determine some things on their own and how much he puts in the seniors. Also, just another little tidbit that I noticed that I had noticed just from being at games over the last couple of years and watching him as a coach. But Cooley's little head nods and kind of like twitches during the games kind of got exposed a little bit, which was funny to notice close up because you always see when he watches, the flex offense develop or he watches them on the defensive end, he just does these little quick tiny nods to himself, which is has been his tendency for the last 4 to 5 years. Having that zoomed in was kind of interesting. It almost made me a little anxious watching him. It was just a nonstop head twitch. But that was another thing that I noticed and kind of focused on for a little bit.
All right, so then we'll look ahead here to Providence's win at home against Butler, 70-60. Jalen Lindsey, huge at the end of the first half with those 2 big threes in the last minute and a half or so, closed the gap down to 4 heading into halftime. And then Alpha Diallo woke up after an 0-7 first half, was very, very impressive in the second half. Providence started the second half 8 of 8 from the field, 16 of 22 overall in the second half. Kyron Cartwright led the way, double-double, 18 points, 11 assists, 15 of his 18 points in the second half. As we mentioned earlier, Khalif Young started in place of Nate Watson, who's still dealing with the flu. Cooley indicated Watson had been out of practice a couple days before, still dealing with the sickness. Interesting game Saturday. Like I mentioned about Max Strus before, it just seemed like Ed Cooley has decided he's going to pull a Belichick and just try to take away the other team's best option, and he did that against Keelan Martin, who did not score in double figures after he had 37 points the last time out against Marquette. Just one thing to mention, the crowd. I know Chris was mentioning before we started recording that good to have the student section back because the crowd was, on TV, came across very well. I know they were near a sellout again, I think 12,600 or so in that ballpark. So Ed Cooley mentioned it after the game. But another big win, 4-2 in the Big East.
Yeah, what stood out to me in the at least in the second half of the Butler game was how Ed Cooley basically drew a line in the sand and went with 6 players after going with a 9-man rotation in the first half. You know, it's almost like he realized Nate Watson had been feeling under the weather, hadn't really practiced much. Mekhi Ashton-Langford was struggling. Drew Edwards wasn't really providing much of a spark. And Ed Cooley went with the starters for the first almost 7+ minutes of the second half, and that's when PC really made it surge and brought Isaiah Jackson in off the bench to at least close the game. But the key to me was like the play of Khalif Young. He was very solid, 8 points, 8 rebounds. Maybe obviously the best game he's had in Big East play. Maybe the best game he's had all season. That's what stood out to me.
Yeah, I mean, it was similar to their approach over the last couple of games. Early on in the year, Providence, like you talked about before, they had an issue early on in the season with other teams' star players. Even against teams like Ryder and against teams like Brown and stuff, they were getting beat, whether they were winning the game or losing the game. The star player on the other team, the leading scorer on the other team, was able to do, basically whatever they wanted. On the offensive end, and they've done a nice job changing that. They shut down Strus against DePaul, and Merrick they let him score. They kind of did the same thing with Kamar Baldwin on Monday, and he was phenomenal. 25 points, and he had 7 rebounds, and he was good. But Keelan Martin was coming off one of the best games of his career at DePaul, and he had 6 points. He was 3 for 13 from the field, and I think they did a really good job with him. And kind of letting Baldwin do his thing and knowing that, Martin was their guy. That's who their focus needed to stay on. And so that was awesome. Diallo and Cartwright came alive in the second half. They need those 2 guys to be going. As everyone knows, they got to be some of their main contributors, and they were great. I thought Isaiah Jackson quietly again was very good. He was 5 for 6 from the line. He played 18 minutes. He only had 7 points, but he had 7 big rebounds. He was, playing kind of bully ball underneath sometimes, which was huge. And for the first time in a while, Khalif Young was pretty big underneath. And, maybe that's the Emmitt Holt effect and having Emmitt Holt back there to tell him, to body up underneath. But he was great. He had 8 rebounds, 8 points. He was 4 for 5 from the field. He had 2 blocks, I think, on the 1 possession, which was pretty great. But it was great to see him play strong underneath and step up when needed because, Nate was still sick and still battling the flu or whatever's going on there. So I thought it was a great second half, and they still played pretty good on defense. In the first half, they were still in striking distance, only down 4. They shot like 30% or something like that in the first half, and so the fact that they were only down 4 going into the second half was huge. And then they just were awesome in the second half. They outscored them 45-31, and the crowd was into it, and they kept feeding off of them. And it was an all around effort in the second half. So it was a nice win and definitely a big-time step in the trek to 10 Big East wins.
Yeah, 4-2. So 4-2 through 6. I think that's about where I would have expected, just blindly, not considering who they beat, who they lost. I think 4-2 is realistic through 6. And then so obviously they have 12 more to go to get at least 6 more wins. So you go finish out the season 500, and you're probably in the NCAA tournament fairly comfortably. maybe not a 4 or 5 seed like people may have hoped, but I think as long as they, at this point, having dealt with some injuries with obviously Emmitt Holt and Cartwright's been hobbled, they've had Diallo out, Malik White, who I expect may play Saturday, though no official word on that yet. He just seemed like he started practicing a little bit last week, so he's obviously pretty close to at least getting back on the floor in some capacity. So that's an addition coming back.
He looked pretty good in warm-ups, too, on Monday. He was moving around pretty well, better than he has been over the last week or so.
Yeah, so I think you'll probably I haven't heard anything or seen anything, but I think given the fact that there's been nearly a week since the last game, I think you'll see him, barring any setbacks, on Saturday. But interesting angle that Cooley has been employing here, and mixing the man in the zone a little bit, and really focusing on the other team's best player, which has been a problem with over the last. Obviously, maybe Marcus Howard was the thing that really solidified his game plan, where he just went off 52, and they realized they need to just contain the best offensive player, and whoever it is, and allow a secondary or tertiary piece to kind of get some points that in the end of because 60 points. DePaul, I think, has been putting up, they were averaging 87 or 88 points a game coming into this game, and the over-under was 147, so went significantly under at 130, obviously. So Providence's defense, I think, as much or more than the fact that they're healthy, and Cartwright's playing well, and Bullock's been solid, and Diallo and Jackson have been playing pretty well, Lindsey's shooting well. I think the possibly even the larger story, or at least it's right there, has been Providence's defense. I mean, really, that's won them a few of the last games that certainly Xavier, I think that was an under-talked about thing. The defense was so good. The zone was really the best that I've seen them play a zone was against Xavier, and they've just been solid. And rebounding has been better. It's still not great, but it's been better. Obviously, Khalif Young, you mentioned, having a pretty good rebounding night against Butler. Bullock has been solid. Pretty much you can pencil him in for 7 to 10 rebounds every single game. And interestingly, they've been playing a lot of the smaller lineups. Part of it, I think, is because the 5 guys have been pretty ineffective, but also matchups. Cooley seems, and their offense has just been so much better when they're playing the smaller lineup with Bullock at the 5, Lindsey at the 4. So they've managed to continue to play high-level defense while having the smaller lineup in. The smaller lineup was the catalyst behind the 22-0 run that got them back into the DePaul game and put them over the top. So they've managed to figure out a way to play solid defense and have the lineup they want for offense that has been much more efficient than getting really not much out of the 5 spot beyond maybe Watson getting 8 or 10 points or 15 points against a smaller inside guy. So interesting to see going forward if this formula continues. Obviously, Creighton on Saturday. Some very skilled players who kind of did what they wanted against Providence the last time.
I believe I wrote going into the Xavier game was how PC had struggled against the opposition's top scorer. And it was a growing problem. When a player scores 52 points, that's when you really the antenna really goes up. But ever since Marcus Howard went off of 52 points, I think PC and Ed Cooley has done a very solid job in terms of holding the opposition's top scorer in check. I mean, Martin coming in, averaging Big East leading 25 points per game, coming off a 37-point barrage. I mean, those are the type of players that are easy to pick out of a lineup because they score so many points. They're at the top of the scouting reports, but defending them was an issue for the Friars earlier this season, but they've certainly done a better job. And also, it probably attributes to the health of the group, too. Somebody like an Alpha Diallo who's long and lanky and can guard multiple positions. The emergence of Isaiah Jackson getting more and more comfortable and, as a result, getting more and more minutes. I think that also has to play a factor in PC doing a better job against the opposing team's top scorers.
Yeah, I was not a huge fan of the smaller lineup earlier in the year. I wasn't crazy about Bullock at the 5, but I've been proven very wrong, especially over the last 3 games. It really showed against Xavier, the smaller lineup, dropping into the zone, and the activity in that zone and the active hands. I haven't seen something like that on a Cooley coach team in a while. And obviously it worked. I mean, they stunted Makura and Blewett in that game. Blewett didn't even score in the second half. Xavier, and it worked against Strus and it worked against Keelan Martin. And they're able to be more active and their rotations have been tight. They can make some pretty solid switches, which they weren't doing in their earlier on in their non-conference schedule. They've really improved that. I don't know if that's because they're more healthy as of late, or if it's just practice and meshing together as a team without Emmitt underneath. But they've been able to really use that smaller lineup effectively, and Rodney's been able to play big, like you said. He's good for 6 or 7 boards at least a game, which is huge, and you need him underneath like that. So I love it, and it's just a lot of energy on defense. And I think at home, I say it a lot about the home crowd, but that's a big factor. They can really feed off the crowd, and I think when the crowd is, standing up on defensive stands and they're on a run and stuff, it really brings out a lot of energy on the defensive end, and it is a huge difference maker. So I have, loved what they've done on the defensive end as of late, especially against their stars. It'll be interesting against Creighton, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a few, to see kind of how they handle Marcus Howard. I know he had 18 the last time and had a pretty big first half against them. Maybe they'll try and force Martin Crampool to, maybe do a little bit, Kyrie Thomas to do a little bit, and focus on Foster. It'll be interesting to see how they handle that, because all 3 of those guys average double figures. So that'll be interesting. But on a positive note, their defense has been hugely active and really, really great as of late.
Yeah, we might as well go there now. Creighton 14-4 right now, 4-2 in the Big East. So they're playing as we record this tonight. They're playing, they're playing Seton Hall tonight. Later on this evening after we record. So the record obviously will change. But as of right now, Marcus Foster leading scorer, 18.8 a game. As you mentioned, Kyrie Thomas and Martin. I feel like I should have nailed this already. Crampell. So he also in double figures at 12.3 a game. So they pretty balanced scoring, but Foster obviously pretty explosive, as you mentioned. Cooley and Greg McDermott, good friends. So always an interesting matchup when these two teams play. Providence has done pretty well against Creighton at home in Big East play since the Blue Jays joined the league. So I think the number will probably be pretty tight for this game. Obviously, pending what happens against Seton Hall. But I always find these games to be fun and interesting because Creighton runs very fun offense. Greg McDermott allows them to kind of get up and down and allow his guards to sort of just take over. Although, they still have, and they just shoot a ton of threes, which is always kind of fun. But I don't know what you're most concerned about for Providence heading into this game against Creighton.
It should be a relatively easy scouting report. It's almost like you're dusting off what happened. They played each other on New Year's Eve. And, Creighton shot 10 out of 30 from 3-point range that day. Toby Hegner, you got to stay with somebody like him. He kind of hurt PC in that day. And, obviously Marcus Foster, he's like the Marcus Howard of, Creighton. Marquette, I should say, just because he's a top scorer and he commands a lot of attention. So maybe regarding the 3-point line, something that PC has traditionally done very well under Ed Cooley, I think that will come into play on Saturday.
Well, my initial concern when they played Creighton the first time round was obviously Marcus Foster's always a concern. He's most likely going to get his, and that's something you're just going to try and limit. You can't really totally stop him, so you're just going to try and limit him. My other major concern was Crampool. He's one of the more athletic bigs in the Big East, which earlier on in the season was causing some issues for Nate Watson and Khalif Young. He's a guy who can really stretch out, and he shoots threes a decent amount for a guy his size. He's 6'9", like 220, 225, so he's a bigger kid. But he's a stretch, kind of a Euro-style big who can cause some problems for a stay-at-home big like Khalif. But, you go back to what we've been talking about, playing Rodney at the 5 and Jalen at the 4 and going with that smaller lineup. That kind of eliminates a major threat there for Crampool to do a lot of damage. So I think that kind of covers that. I wouldn't be surprised if he has a decent day, though. With the way things have been going lately, I would hope that they would focus on limiting Foster and maybe turn towards Kyrie Thomas or Crampool. But, Creighton's a great team. They are extremely, extremely effective on the offensive end. They don't turn the ball over a lot. And they can get to the rim pretty easily, even though they do shoot a lot of threes. So I would say just limiting them for the most part on offense is tough. They're a team kind of similar to Marquette in my mind in terms of efficiency. So I don't know. We'll see. They don't have very long possessions. They're up-tempo, which Providence does like to run. They're pretty up-tempo as well. But maybe they'll try and slow them down a little bit and kind of take them out of it. Because once Providence gets into that half-court defense, they've been pretty successful as of late. So that would be my biggest concern, is being able to slow them down and force them into a half-court offense.
Yeah, I think that's looking. I mean, I haven't done a ton of in-depth yet on this game, but just my initial thought with Creighton is usually try to slow it down, try to play a half-court game. Not that they're bad in the half-court, but you mentioned the possession. Just to give people an idea, Providence does not play overly slow, and Providence's average possession length is 16.9 seconds, which is about middle of the road in terms of Division I basketball. Creighton averages 14.7 seconds. That's the 8th shortest possession in college basketball. So they really like to push. Very efficient on offense, pretty efficient on defense, considering they don't really have a world beater type of situation. But they just do everything kind of right. They limit offensive rebounds. They keep you off the free throw line. So just, always a tough matchup. I think KenPom has Creighton winning 78-77 right now. So that's, another tight Big East game. They're all going to be this way the rest of the way. And obviously looking ahead to after Saturday, very difficult stretch, 3 on the road, at Villanova, at Seton Hall, at Marquette. So to get a 5th win right now, to go to 5-2, if they can beat Creighton on Saturday, would be very important to their drive to 10, as I've been talking about. They really need, I think 10 wins is pretty much a lock to get them in the NCAA tournament. Their numbers are pretty good. I think the RPI is 39 right now. So you're talking about 12 more games. You got to get 6 more wins. These 3 on the road, if you can steal one on the road, more power to you. Winning at Villanova, always hard, even though it's at Wells Fargo because they don't really have the pavilion this year. Seton Hall is a Wednesday night game at the Prudential Center, so you never know there, but Delgado is such a tough matchup, and their guards are so good. And then Providence has really not done well historically at Marquette. So winning Saturday, I think winning against Butler Saturday was bigger in terms of making sure that they didn't drop back to 500, and you always got to defend your home floor. Creighton just dropping out of the top 25 after they lost to Xavier, so they went from 25 to 26 in the most recent poll. But getting the win Saturday would be a nice little winning streak heading into this difficult road trip, which could easily go 0-3. So I think that's why this game is maybe more important than an average Saturday home game in January for Providence.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, it would just be so nice to make this a 4-game winning streak to jump onto this road trip, because it's a brutal road trip. They go Tuesday. What is it? So it's Tuesday at Nova, the following Wednesday at Seton Hall, and then that Saturday at Marquette. And they're all on the road. Like, that's a tough schedule. So, not to be a negative Nancy here, but you could totally see them going 0-3 on that road trip, like you said. So that would make this Saturday game that much bigger. Monday's win against Butler was obviously huge for that reason. Ideally, they come off this road trip and win back-to-back games at home against Georgetown and DePaul, pending any, I think they should win those games. And then they face Villanova again, and then Butler and Seton Hall. So it's another tough 3-game stretch. So, yeah, if they could find a win in one of these 3 games coming up in that road trip, that'd be great. But it all starts Saturday against Creighton. It would be a huge win just to set them off on the right foot on a 4-game winning streak heading into Nova. That would be ideal. They've won at Nova in the past. Obviously, they're not a tough. They are a tough team. But this would be a nice kind of cushion going on to this road trip if they could win on Saturday.
Yeah, and Ed Cooley has talked about it all the time, about making sure that you defend the home court. No worse than maybe going 8-2 at home. PC is kind of, in terms of that prognostication, losing to Marquette, as devastating that was, they probably picked that back up with a huge win against Xavier. Staying the course against Butler this past Monday, but you don't want to stub your toe going into Saturday against Creighton because, like you said, a big 3-game road trip is looming, with one of those games being at, right now, the number 1 team in the country, Villanova.
Yeah, 5-2 looks a lot better than 4-3 when those are the next 3 games. The last thing I just wanted to discuss before we sign off this week, Rodney Bullock. We talked a lot about Bullock in the beginning of the year, being very up and down. You get good Rodney some nights, you get bad Rodney other nights. I would contend that I think that lately we've gotten solid Rodney. He's just been he hasn't been great, he hasn't been bad, pretty solid. And I think his solid play, being able to play the 5, and the balanced scoring that they've been able to put together around him, I think this is the ideal situation for Rodney Bullock. He doesn't have to score 25. He can score 12 to 17, get 8 rebounds, play 35 minutes, and that's enough for them to win. I think that's where he wants to be. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, since the beginning of the season, when we talked about Rodney Bullock, especially after the Houston Baptist and Minnesota game where he scored in single digits, and we were wondering, okay, is Rodney Bullock going to get on track? We said the answer is yes. We've seen that. He's had, a 30-point game, I believe, right before the Big East play against Sacred Heart. And we thought that, okay, maybe he's going to have to prepare to take on a greater workload because of injuries to Diallo and Cartwright and not knowing what their situations were health-wise. I think maybe that stretch where there was no Diallo and Cartwright was in and out of the lineup, that had told Rodney Bullock that, okay, it's really all on you to shoulder the scoring burden, or at least the majority of it. And since the return of full health for the Friars, he's been maybe the most efficient that we've seen him in his 3 years at PC, Rodney Bullock.
Yeah, and he's been, I think the word I would use is engaged, because a lot of times he was not engaged. On the defensive end, he'd kind of take possessions off, and there were some questionable shots where he would just kind of, just float around on offense, and he wasn't engaged. But as of late, on the defensive end, he's active. He's right in the thick of that zone, and maybe it's because he has a bigger role in defense, because he's been playing that 5. And so maybe he's taken on more responsibility, so he feels the need to be more active. Not really sure what it is, but I would definitely agree in saying this is probably the best stretch, consistency-wise and engagement-wise, of Rodney Bullock. And I think it's really ideal. He didn't play against Marquette, but if you go back to the Creighton game, the last 4 games, he's been 30-plus minutes. He's at, I think, 12 and 12 the last 2 games, and before that it was 15 and 17, and he's getting, 6+ rebounds a game, and it's really, his efficiency's good, and it's good to see him doing this because they really need him down the stretch. And the fact that he is able to do this without having to score 28 points a game is huge. So I think it allows him to focus a little bit more on playing that 5 and kind of being a cornerstone of their defense, and maybe takes a little pressure off of him on the offensive end and kind of lets him do his thing, but remain engaged. So yeah, I would definitely agree. He's been tremendous.
Great job, guys.
Back here in the studio after the discussion we had between Brendan, Chris, and I want to give a shout-out here to Brendan, something I forgot to mention while we were recording. Brendan was named the 2017 Rhode Island Sports Writer of the Year by the National Sports Media Association. Not Brendan's first award, won't be his last. A special shout-out to Brendan there. I want to give everybody a little heads up on the timing here. We had a little issue obtaining the audio, so we recorded Wednesday night prior to Creighton's game against Seton Hall. Creighton with a big-time win against Seton Hall at home. But unfortunately, they did lose Martin Krampel, who they announced on Thursday does in fact have a torn ACL, and he will miss the rest of the season. So they lose their third leading scorer, one of the guys who was in double figures. He had 13 points against Providence last time out. But obviously, big loss for them. As we discussed, pretty quick turnaround. After Saturday, Providence plays Tuesday night down in Philadelphia at Villanova at the Wells Fargo Center. But they do get a little bit of a break, about a week off to practice and rest before they have to travel down to Seton Hall January 31st, Wednesday night at the Prudential Center. So keep your eyes peeled for maybe a podcast early in the week next week to talk Villanova and to recap Saturday's game against Creighton. And then we have a little bit of time in between, so could be maybe we'll do some recruiting talk. Maybe we get Some gambling action in here. As of right now, Ken Pom has Creighton beating Providence 78-75. So Providence, the line will be out Friday afternoon, most likely around 2-3 p.m. So keep your eyes on PCBB1917.com. I'll have the opening line post up at some point tomorrow afternoon. And I expect Providence to be a small dog at home. But you could also see it opening maybe at a pick or Providence even -1 because Ken Pom not really factoring in Cranepool's injury. And Creighton really is a different team on the road. I think we kind of touched on it a little bit in the discussion before, but they really dominated Seton Hall at the CenturyLink Center on Wednesday night. That doesn't really seem to translate as much on the road for the Blue Jays. If that 78-75 score in Ken Pom is to be thought of, to be an accurate gauge of where Vegas is going to be heading for an opening total, you'd think it'd be in the low 150s. They opened, as I mentioned before, 147 against Butler and went way under at 130. Providence's defense has been very good, especially at home. Creighton not as good on the road. I would maybe look at to see if that does open at around 150, 152 in that ballpark. Maybe taking a little bit on the under there. Could be an interesting play. I also wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of line movement for this game just because a lot of times the books are sort of just going a lot off analytics and the metrics like Ken Pom. And so if they open at a number like Creighton -2, people might look at that and scratch their heads a little with Providence being at home on a win streak and Creighton just losing one of their better scorers. And that, you could see some money flood in on the Friars there, getting two or 3 points at home. So interesting angle. Keep an eye on the Twitter. I'll be updating with the bet tickets as they come in. Percentage of spread bets, as I talked about in the last podcast. Always interesting to keep an eye on where the money's going and who's picking who, how much, what the percentages are, how much money is on the money line, the over, the under, the spread. Just as a reminder for everybody, this game is on CBS Sports Network, not on Fox Sports 1. So CBS Sports Network, it'll be Tom McCarthy and Jordan Cornette on the call. You can also obviously get the radio broadcast, John Rook, Joe Hassett, WEI 103.7 FM, and Friars.com. You can also find them on TuneIn, and obviously you can always check out Friar TV for audio and video needs. He is back from vacation. That son of a bitch had to take a vacation. Really, I mean, who does he think he is? But should be a good crowd on Saturday, less than 500 tickets as of Thursday afternoon. So it should be close to a sellout. Hope everybody gets out to the dunk. Safe trip there, safe trip home. Should be a big game. We'll talk to everybody next week.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Providence Friarcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
Follow Mike Hopkins on Twitter and Instagram
at PCBB1917. Like the Facebook page, and as always, stay classy, Friartown.